Beggar Ghost Revenge. The haunting of a cruel mother. Early one morning at a bustling market, a poor, ragged girl named Lily watched other children rush to school. Lily, in her tattered clothes, longed to join them, but her reality was harsh. She lived by begging, as the people at the market were used to her constant pleas for food or spare change. One day, her path crossed with a cold-hearted woman named Mrs. Grace and her son Timmy. Hungry and desperate, Lily approached the woman, only to be met with harsh rejection and a stinging slap. However, Timmy felt compassion and later sneaked a food package to Lily, showing a glimpse of kindness. This event stirred something dark within Mrs. Grace, leading to a horrifying confrontation where she and her servant, Anne, lured Lily to the house under false pretenses. What follows is a tale of tragedy and terror as Mrs. Grace's cruelty culminates in a chain of supernatural events, with the spirit of Lily returning to seek justice. The haunting escalates, leaving everyone trapped in a web of fear and regret, showing that some wrongs never truly fade away. Part 1. The Market's Lonely Child. The marketplace bustled with life in the early morning. Stalls overflowed with fresh produce, fish wriggled in buckets, and the smell of frying food wafted through the air, mingling with the chatter of vendors calling out their wares. Shoppers pushed through the crowd, haggling for the best price on their daily necessities. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale golden light over the scene, painting an illusion of warmth. For most, this was just another morning, a rush of routine, a hunt for bargains before the day officially began. But for one little girl, this morning was just like any other, another day of loneliness and hunger. From the edge of the market, Lily stood silently, half hidden behind an old wooden crate. Her tiny frame was draped in clothes that clung to her body in tatters, frayed at the edges, covered in mud and grime that had become a second skin. Her hair, knotted and matted, hung limply around her face, framing large eyes that stared out at the world with a mixture of longing and despair. Lily's stomach rumbled loudly, a constant reminder of the emptiness within her. She wrapped her arms around her middle, trying to quell the hunger pangs that gnawed at her insides like a relentless beast. From her vantage point, she watched the other children with a deep yearning that was almost painful. They ran past her, their laughter ringing in the crisp morning air, their faces clean, their clothes neat and pressed. They clutched lunchboxes and bags, chatting excitedly about the day ahead, school something she could only dream of. Lily's heart ached with a desire so intense it made her chest hurt. What would it be like to be one of them, to wear a proper uniform, to carry books instead of an empty bag, to sit in a classroom instead of the cold, hard ground? She bit her lip, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. Crying would do her no good it never had. Her life was one of cold reality, far removed from the warmth of those children's lives. She was the market's shadow, the one people avoided, the reminder of poverty that they did not wish to acknowledge. She took a deep, shaky breath and glanced down at her hands. They were covered in dirt, her nails blackened from digging through trash in search of anything she could eat or sell. Her stomach growled again, louder this time, demanding attention. Today she would have to try her luck with the vendors. Maybe someone would take pity on her and spare a crust of bread, an old fruit, anything. But the vendors knew her too well. They had seen her every morning, lingering at the edges of the market like a stray dog. Some had given her scraps before, but most had learned to turn a blind eye to her pitiful state. She had become part of the background, just another fixture in the market that they could choose to ignore. Lily scanned the crowd, her eyes falling on a nearby food stall. The vendor was a stern woman, arms folded across her chest as she guarded her wares. Freshly steamed buns sat piled high in baskets, still warm, steam curling off them invitingly. Lily's mouth watered at the sight. She could almost taste the softness of the bread, the savory filling inside. If she could just get close enough. Mustering her courage, she stepped forward, moving cautiously towards the store. Each step felt like a journey, the weight of her hopes hanging heavily around her neck. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached. the smell of the food making her lightheaded. She stopped a few feet away, not daring to get too close. The vendor had spotted her already, her gaze narrowing, lips curling into a frown. "What do you want, girl?" the vendor snapped, her voice like a whip cracking in the air. Lily flinched, her gaze dropping to the ground. She knew better than to look these people in the eyes, it only made them angrier. Swallowing her fear, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I was wondering if you might have something, anything, you don't need." The vendor's eyes darkened. "You again," she muttered, shaking her head. "Always begging, always looking for a handout." "Get lost. I don't have anything for you." Lily's cheeks burned with shame. She opened her mouth to plead, but the words caught in her throat. The vendor's eyes were like cold steel, daring her to say another word. With a nod, Lily turned and slumped back to her crate, every step heavy with the weight of rejection. She could feel the eyes of the other market goers on her, could hear the whispers as they gossiped about the little beggar who had no place here. "Disgusting," someone muttered as they passed her. "She smells awful." "Why is she even here?" another voice said. "You'd think the market would do something about it." Lily sank to the ground, hugging her knees to her chest. The cold of the cobblestone seeped through her thin clothes, chilling her to the bone. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the shadows, where no one could see her, where no one could judge her. But she couldn't. She was here, and she was hungry, and she had to survive, somehow. Her gaze wandered back to the food stalls, the vibrant colors of fresh fruits and vegetables taunting her. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She had to try again. Maybe the next stall would show some kindness. She picked herself up, slowly, like a marionette whose strings had been half severed, and moved towards the next potential source of charity. But it was always the same. Faces turned away, noses wrinkled at her approach. Some vendors waved her off before she even had a chance to speak, while others yelled at her to leave. She was a stain on their morning, a reminder of the harsh world outside their bubble of comfort. After what felt like an eternity, Lily found herself back at her crate, empty-handed, stomach twisting painfully. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, and she wiped at them furiously with the back of her hand. She would not cry, not here, not in front of them. If they saw her crying, they would laugh, they would mock her misery, and she couldn't bear that. She curled up, wrapping her arms around her knees, and rested her forehead against them. In that moment, she felt utterly, completely alone. The market around her bustled on, oblivious to her existence, to her suffering. She was a ghost in their world, unseen, unheard, and in that isolation, a seed of something dark began to take root in her heart, a flicker of anger, of resentment. Why was it fair that they had so much while she had nothing? Why did they get to walk past her, noses in the air, as if she were dirt beneath their feet? They didn't know what it was like to be cold, to be hungry, to feel like you were less than human. They didn't care. Lily shivered, though not entirely from the cold. A thought crept into her mind, whispering to her in a voice that was both hers and not hers. One day they will see you. One day they will see you. One day they will not be able to ignore you. The thought both scared and thrilled her. She pushed it down, burying it beneath the immediate concern of finding food. But deep inside she knew something had changed. The market had turned its back on her for too long. She was no longer just a lonely child. She was becoming something else, something that would not be ignored. The day dragged on, each hour marked by the growl of her stomach and the ache in her limbs. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, Lily remained where she was, eyes fixed on the horizon. She would wait, as she always did. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance. Maybe someone would finally show her the kindness she so desperately craved. Or maybe they would not. And if they didn't, well, she wasn't sure what she would do. But the thought of it lingered, a dark, silent promise that wrapped around her heart and squeezed. The market thrived with its noise, its life, its life, its life there. But at the edge of that life stood a girl, a specter of need and neglect, her gaze cold and empty. She was the market's shadow, its beggar ghost, and she would not be forgotten for much longer. Part 2. A harsh encounter. Morning broke over the marketplace, casting a pale, silvery light on the cobblestones. The vendors were already bustling about, setting up their stalls and arranging their wares. The scent of freshly cooked food hung in the air, mingling with the earthy smells of fruits, vegetables, and the metallic tang of fish. The market was coming alive, a hive of noise and activity as people crowded in, hunting for the best ingredients to start their day. Lily woke from her restless sleep in the alley behind the market, the rough stone walls at her back cold and unwelcoming. She blinked against the first light of dawn, rubbing the grime from her eyes with the back of her hand. The night had been freezing, and she had curled into herself for warmth, her thin clothes offering little protection against the chill. As she stood, her stomach clenched painfully, reminding her that it had been days since she had eaten anything substantial. Hunger was her constant companion, gnawing at her insides like a beast that refused to be ignored. She peered around the corner of the alley, watching as the marketplace came to life. People moved in clusters, laughing, bargaining, paying no heed to the shadows lurking on the fringes. Lily was one of those shadows, and she knew it. The market-goers had grown used to her presence, a small, ragged figure that haunted the stalls in search of scraps. Most had learned to ignore her, some had become actively hostile, but today she could not afford to be ignored. She needed food, desperately. Taking a deep breath, Lily steeled herself and stepped out into the marketplace. She moved cautiously, hugging the walls, her eyes darting from stall to stall, looking for any sign of a friendly face. But there were none. Every vendor she recognized wore the same expression, wary, annoyed, ready to chase her off if she came too close. The pit in her stomach grew deeper, not just from hunger, but from the gnawing sense of hopelessness. Was today going to be another day of rejection? Her eyes caught a movement near one of the stalls selling steamed buns. A woman stood there, dressed in a well-tailored coat, her posture straight and commanding. She held herself with an air of superiority, her gaze sharp and unyielding as she supervised the vendor packaging food for her. Beside her stood a young boy, around the same age as Lily, with a mop of dark hair and wide, curious eyes. He was holding onto the woman's hand, looking up at the buns with a mixture of impatience and excitement. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The woman was obviously wealthy, and people like her often bought more than they needed. Maybe, just maybe, there would be a chance for some leftovers. She hesitated for a moment, doubt flooding her mind. Would this woman be any different from the others? But as the hunger twisted painfully in her gut, she forced the doubt aside. She had to try. She had nothing left to lose. Gathering her courage, Lily approached, each step heavy with fear and hope. She could feel the eyes of other market-goers on her as she moved forward, their whispers following her like a dark cloud. "Isn't that the beggar girl?" Someone murmured. "What is she doing now?" Another voice hissed. Ignoring the words that stabbed at her like knives, Lily kept her focus on the woman and the boy. She drew closer, her eyes fixed on the buns, the steam curling up into the cold morning air, filling her nose with the intoxicating scent of freshly cooked food. She swallowed hard, her mouth watering. The woman, Mrs. Grace? As Lily would soon learn, glanced at her for the first time. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of disgust crossing her face, as she took in the sight of the grimy child standing before her. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse echoing in her ears. This was it. She had to speak. She had to ask. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lily stammered, her voice quivering. She forced herself to meet Mrs. Grace's eyes, though it felt like staring into an abyss. "Could you, please, spare some food? I haven't eaten in days." For a brief, fleeting second, silence hummed in the air. Mrs. Grace stared at Lily, her expression unreadable. The market around them seemed to blur and fade, all noise drowned out by the sound of Lily's own heartbeat. She could almost taste the warmth of the bun, feel it in her hands. Maybe this time. But then Mrs. Grace's face twisted into a sneer. "Spare you some food," she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. She looked Lily up and down, her eyes flicking over the dirt-streaked face, the ragged clothes, the scrawny limbs. "You filthy little beggar," she hissed. "Why don't you go find some work instead of lurking around here, bothering decent people?" Lily flinched as if struck. The words hit her like a blow to the stomach, knocking the breath out of her. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, but the words stuck in her throat. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. Why? Why did it have to be like this? All she wanted was a scrap of food. Mrs. Gracie's eyes gleamed with something dark, something almost malicious. "I've seen you hanging around here every day," she continued, her voice rising. "Always looking for handouts. Well, not from me. Now, get out of my sight." And then, before Lily could react, Mrs. Gracie's hand lashed out. The slap was sharp, vicious, sending a jolt of pain across Lily's cheek. She staggered back, gasping, her hand flying up to cover the stinging skin. The world spun around her, the marketplace a blur of colors and shapes as she stumbled, struggling to keep her balance. The crowd around them gasped, some turning away in discomfort, others watching with morbid fascination. No one stepped forward to intervene, no one offered a hand to help. It was as if they were all frozen in place, unwilling to involve themselves in the spectacle before them. Lily felt a sob rise in her throat, choking her. Her face burned, not just from the pain of the slap, but from the humiliation. She had been foolish to hope, foolish to think that this woman might show her a shred of kindness. She wanted to run, to hide, but her legs felt like lead. She could do nothing but stand there, tears streaming down her cheeks. From the corner of her eye, she saw the boy, Timmy, staring at her with wide, shocked eyes. His face was pale, his lips parted as if he wanted to say something. Pity and sorrow etched across his features, an expression that seemed so out of place next to his mother's fury. For a moment their eyes met, and Lily saw something there, compassion, perhaps even a desire to help. But he didn't move. He didn't speak. Fear held him in place, fear of his mother's wrath. "Timmy, don't look at that beggar," Mrs. Gray snapped, grabbing his arm and jerking him away. "We're leaving. Now." Timmy hesitated, casting one last glance at Lily, his eyes filled with regret. But he allowed his mother to drag him away, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in defeat. And just like that, they were gone, swallowed up by the crowd. Lily stood there, her chest heaving, tears spilling over her cheeks. She was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the whirlwind of emotions raging inside her. Anger, shame, pain, helplessness. They all swirled together, forming a storm that threatened to consume her. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them see her, to make them understand. But she knew it was useless. She was nothing to them, just a beggar girl, a nuisance, a problem to be ignored or pushed aside. Slowly she turned and walked away, her steps heavy and unsteady. Her cheek throbbed where Mrs. Grace had struck her, the sting a reminder of her place in this world. She could still feel the eyes of the market goers on her, their whispers following her like a shadow. "Serves her right," someone muttered. "She shouldn't be begging around here." Lily squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the words, the stares, the judgment. She made her way back to her crate at the edge of the market, collapsing onto the hard ground. She curled into herself, hugging her knees, trying to make herself as small as possible. The sobs came then, racking her frail body, tearing through her like a force of nature. She cried not just for the slap, but for the cruelty, the rejection, the unfairness of it all. In the depths of her despair, something else stirred within her. A darkness, a whisper of anger that she had never allowed herself to feel fully before. It was as if a door had been cracked open, letting in a sliver of the darkness that had been growing inside her for so long. "They will see me," the voice whispered in her mind. "One day, they will all see me." Lily shivered, not from the cold, but from the chilling sense of something changing inside her. She didn't know what it meant or where it would lead. But as she sat there, alone and broken, she felt a flicker of determination amidst the storm of her emotions. She would survive this. She had to. And one day, they would not be able to push her away so easily. The marketplace around her continued to bustle, the vendors shouting, the customers laughing, oblivious to the little girl huddled at its edge. But in the shadows, a seed of something dark had been planted, something that would grow and change everything. And it had begun with a single, harsh encounter. Part 3. A glimpse of kindness. The market carried on with its usual rhythm, the noise of haggling and chatter filling the air as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Life continued for those who had food to eat, places to go, and people to meet. But for Lily, time moved sluggishly, each moment stretching out painfully as hunger gnawed at her belly. The sting from Mrs. Gracie's slap still burned on her cheek, a mark of her harsh reality. Her mind was a swirl of anger, sadness, and hopelessness. She pressed her knees to her chest, seeking comfort in the tightness of her embrace, trying to keep herself from completely falling apart. But unknown to her, a small act of kindness was brewing amidst the chaos and indifference. Timmy, Mrs. Gracie's son, couldn't forget the look on Lily's face. The sadness in her eyes had seared itself into his memory, haunting him even as he followed his mother through the market. She was now busy purchasing various goods, blissfully unaware of the turmoil raging inside her son. Timmy glanced nervously at his mother, who was occupied with a vendor, haggling over prices with an air of superiority. Taking a deep breath, he let go of her hand and inched away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to do something, anything to help that girl. He couldn't just walk away and pretend he hadn't seen her suffering. His mother had been cruel, and he had stood by in silence, paralyzed by fear. The shame of it weighed on him like a stone. Cautiously, Timmy moved to a nearby stall where the vendor was preparing food packages. He picked up a small, wrapped rice bundle, its warmth seeping through the thin paper into his hands. His stomach twisted with anxiety as he glanced over his shoulder, checking to see if his mother had noticed his absence. But Mrs. Grace was still engrossed in her argument with the vendor, her back turned to him. Taking this as his chance, Timmy quickly slipped the food into his coat pocket and began to weave through the crowd, his eyes scanning for a glimpse of Lily. Lily had retreated to her usual spot, back against the cold stone wall of the marketplace, staring vacantly at the bustling scene before her. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from hunger and defeat. She felt like a ghost, an invisible presence among the living. They passed by her without a glance, without a thought, as if she were nothing more than a piece of litter blown into a corner. A voice whispered, barely audible over the market's din. Lily blinked, snapping out of her daze. She turned her head and saw Timmy standing a few feet away, his face a mixture of apprehension and concern. She stared at him, confused. What did he want? Why was he here? Timmy glanced around nervously, making sure his mother wasn't looking in their direction. Then, with trembling hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the wrapped rice bundle. I brought this for you, he stammered, thrusting the package toward her. Please, take it. Lily froze, her eyes widening as she stared at the offering. For a moment she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Was this a trick? Another cruel joke at her expense? But then she looked into Timmy's eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. He was scared, that much was clear, but there was also a kind of desperate determination in his gaze, as if he needed her to take it. Go on, Timmy urged, his voice a shaky whisper. Before she ceased, with a trembling hand, Lily reached out and took the bundle. The warmth of it seeped into her palm, spreading through her cold fingers, sending a shiver down her spine. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. She hadn't felt warmth like this in so long. It was just a simple package of rice, but to her it was everything. It was life. Tea, thank you, she choked out, clutching the bundle to her chest, as if it were a priceless treasure. She felt the sting of tears trailing down her dirty cheeks. But she didn't care. For this one fleeting moment, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt seen, felt cared for, even if just a little. Timmy gave her a small, nervous smile. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by a wave of fear. He had done what he knew was right, but he also knew the consequences could be dire. His mother would be furious if she found out. "You're welcome," he said softly, backing away. "Just eat it quickly." "Okay," Lee nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to speak again. She watched as Timmy turned and disappeared back into the crowd, glancing over his shoulder one last time to make sure she was okay. She felt a rush of gratitude so intense it nearly made her dizzy. She unwrapped the rice bundle with shaking hands, the scent of the food making her stomach clench in anticipation. She took a small bite, it taste flooding her mouth, and for a brief moment the world faded away. There was no pain, no hunger, no cold, just warmth, just kindness. But this moment of grace was not the last. Across the market, Mrs. Grace had finished her haggling and turned to find Timmy, only to realize he wasn't by her side. Her eyes scanned the market, growing sharp and narrow as she spotted him walking quickly away from a dark corner where Lily sat huddled. Suspicion flared within her like a fire. What was he doing over there? She pushed her way through the crowd, her face darkening with each step, until she reached Timmy, grabbing him by the shoulder. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. Timmy flinched, looking up at her with wide, fearful eyes. I was just what Mrs. Grace snapped, her gaze flicking over to where Lily sat, the rice bundle now clutched in her hands. Realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. She turned back to Timmy, fury blazing in her eyes. "You gave food to that beggar girl, didn't you?" Timmy opened his mouth, trying to find words to explain himself, but nothing came out. His heart raced, terror seizing his throat. He had known this would happen. He had known she would be furious. But standing here, facing the storm that was his mother, he was paralyzed by fear. Mrs. Grace's face twisted with disgust and rage. "How dare you?" she hissed, her grip tightening painfully on his shoulder. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've embarrassed me. You've insulted our family by associating with that vermin." Timmy shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. I just wanted to help Mrs. Grace spat the word as if it were poison. "You don't help people like her. She's nothing but a beggar, a leech on society. And you." She broke off, her gaze snapping back to Lily, who was watching the confrontation with wide, terrified eyes. Mrs. Grace released her son and stormed toward Lily, her fury radiating off her like a palpable wave. The crowd around them fell silent, sensing the brewing storm, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Mrs. Grace snarled, pointing a finger at Lily. "How dare you take food from my son? Who do you think you are?" Lily shrank back, clutching the rice bundle to her chest. She tried to speak, to apologize, but the words caught in her throat. She was too afraid, too overwhelmed by the sheer force of Mrs. Grace's anger. Mrs. Grace loomed over her, her face twisted with contempt. "You think you can just take whatever you want because you're pathetic, because you're hungry? Well, let me tell you something, girl, you don't belong here. You are there, nobody a stain on this market." The words struck Lily like physical blows, each one hammering into her already fragile heart. Tears streamed down her face, and she clutched the rice bundle tighter, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. Mrs. Grace sneered, reaching down to snatch the rice bundle from Lily's grasp. "And you won't be getting any more handouts from us, you hear me?" she spat, her eyes cold and unforgiving. She tossed the bundle aside, sending it tumbling into the dirt. Lily watched as the food hit the ground, the last bit of warmth and kindness in her harsh world now ruined. Something inside her cracked, a fissure opening up in the depths of her soul. The darkness that had been whispering to her since the first encounter grew louder, a voice that promised retribution, that promised she would not be ignored forever. Mrs. Grace turned on her heel, grabbing Timmy by the arm. "We are leaving," she barked, dragging him away. Timmy glanced back at Lily, his eyes wide and filled with regret, but he was powerless against his mother's iron will. As they disappeared into the crowd, Lily remained where she was, her gaze fixed on the crumpled rice bundle lying in the dirt. Tears blurred her vision, but this time they were not just tears of sadness. They were tears of anger, of a simmering rage that had begun to take root inside her. The market around her resumed its noisy bustle, people moving on from the spectacle as if nothing had happened. But for Lily, everything had changed. She picked up the rice bundle, dusting it off with shaky hands, and bit into it defiantly. She would not let Mrs. Grace's cruelty take this small mercy from her. She would survive. She would endure. But somewhere deep inside, a seed of something darker stirred, a promise that one day they would all know what it felt like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone else's whims. The world around her had shown her no kindness, and the time was coming when she would repay that cruelty in kind. The marketplace went on, oblivious to the change in the air, to the shadows deepening in the eyes of the beggar girl they had scorned. For now, Lily was just a child, a hungry beggar. But there was a storm brewing within her, a storm that would one day shatter the peace they took for granted. And that storm was born from a glimpse of kindness, followed by an act of cruelty that would not be forgotten. Part 4. The Trap. The next day arrived, casting a grey, muted light over the marketplace. The air was thick and heavy, as though it were burdened by something ominous. People went about their routines, though there was a strange unease in the air. It felt as though the market itself held its breath, waiting for something dreadful to unfold. Lily awoke in the same corner where she had curled up for the night, her body aching from the cold and rough cobblestones beneath her. Her stomach growled, the hunger more intense than ever, gnawing at her insides like a vicious beast. The memory of yesterday's encounter with Mrs. Grace and the small act of kindness from Timmy filled her mind, a bittersweet mixture of warmth and pain. She sat up, brushing the dirt off her face with trembling hands. Her cheek still stung from where Mrs. Grace had struck her, a bruise forming as a reminder of that cruelty. Despite everything, hope lingered like a stubborn ember, refusing to be extinguished. She had survived another night. Perhaps today she would find some food. Maybe someone would be kind enough to help. As she slowly made her way to the market, she noticed a figure standing just a few feet away, watching her with a neutral expression. It was Anne, Mrs. Grace's servant. Lily hesitated, confusion twisting in her gut. What did Anne want? The woman had been there during Mrs. Grace's outburst yesterday, standing silently in the background. Lily had seen the flicker of pity in Anne's eyes, but the woman had done nothing to intervene. Anne approached her cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her, as if unsure of how to begin. "Hey, girl," she said, her voice low and almost hesitant. "I saw what happened yesterday," Mrs. Grace was. "Hush, I felt bad for you." Lily blinked, taken aback by the unexpected softness in Anne's voice. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever approached her like this, speaking with something that resembled kindness. Her stomach twisted, and hope sparked within her chest, fragile but burning brightly. I'm just hungry," she managed to murmur, her eyes dropping to the ground, afraid to hope too much. Anne glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. Then she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Listen, I might be able to help you. Mrs. Grace told me this morning that she felt bad about yesterday and wants to make up for it." She paused, gauging Lily's reaction before continuing. "She said you can come to the house for a meal. A proper one. Would you like that?" Lily's heart skipped a beat, disbelief washing over her like a cold wave. Was this real? Was it possible that Mrs. Grace had had a change of heart? She searched Anne's face for any hint of deceit, but the woman's expression was calm, almost kind. Lily's stomach growled again, and the thought of a proper meal made her knees weak. It had been so long since she had eaten anything more than scraps. Slowly, cautiously, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. I would like that." Anne straightened, a small smile flickering on her lips. "Good. Follow me." Then she turned and began walking through the market, and Lily hurried to keep up, her heart pounding in her chest. It seemed too good to be true, but at this moment she couldn't afford to let doubt cloud her hope. She needed this. She needed to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still some kindness in the world. As they made their way through the marketplace, the crowd parted around them, casting glances at the pair. Whispers followed in their wake, the market goers murmuring amongst themselves, wondering what was happening. But Lily paid them no mind. She was focused on the path ahead, on the promise of food and warmth waiting for her. They reached the edge of the marketplace and walked through a narrow, winding alley that opened onto a quiet street lined with tall, imposing houses. At the far end stood Mrs. Grace's house, its brick walls rising like a fortress against the sky. A sense of foreboding crept into Lily's mind as they approached, the shadows around the house seeming to stretch out toward them. She hesitated for a brief moment, an icy shiver running down her spine. But Anne glanced back at her and gave a reassuring nod. "Don't worry," Anne said softly. "It's just a meal." Nothing more. Lily swallowed hard, pushing the uneasy feeling aside. She had come this far, and turning back now meant returning to the market with nothing. Her stomach ached, a reminder of why she was doing this. So she took a deep breath and stepped forward, following Anne to the door. Anne opened the door and motioned for Lily to enter. "Go on in," she urged. "The dining room is just through there." Lily stepped inside, her eyes wide as she took in the grand interior. The house was vast and filled with an eerie stillness. The walls were lined with dark wooden panels, and the air was heavy with the scent of dust and old memories. She followed Anne down a long hallway, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath them. The house felt cold, not just in temperature but in atmosphere, as if it were void of any warmth or kindness. A sense of dread settled into her bones, but she forced herself to keep walking, focusing on the promise of a meal. Finally, they reached the dining room. Anne stopped at the doorway and turned to Lily, a strange glint in her eyes. "Wait here," she said curtly, the softness in her voice now replaced by an edge that made Lily's heart skip a beat. Before Lily could respond, Anne stepped back into the hallway, closing the door behind her with a heavy thud. Lily stood in the middle of the room, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. The air was thick and cold, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. She wrapped her arms around herself, glancing around nervously. The room was grand, with a large dining table at its center, chairs set neatly around it. But there was no sign of food, no welcoming warmth. Something was wrong. The door creaked open, and Lee whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. Mrs. Grace stood there, framed by the doorway, her eyes dark and cold as they fixed on Lily. A slow, cruel smile spread across her face, and Lily felt the blood drain from her cheeks. So Mrs. Grace drawled, stepping into the room, her heels kicking against the floor with a deliberate menace. "The little beggar girl has come for her meal." Lily took an involuntary step back, her stomach twisting in fear. I thought," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought you wanted to help me." Mrs. Grace let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed through the room. "Help you? Oh, you poor, stupid girl," she sneered, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Did you really think I would waste food on someone like you? You're nothing." Less than nothing terror gripped Lily's heart as she realized the trap she had walked into. This was no act of kindness. This was a setup, a cruel game orchestrated by Mrs. Grace to mock her, to put her in her place. She glanced toward the door, her mind racing, but Mrs. Grace moved quickly, blocking her path. "You're not going anywhere," Mrs. Grace hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Not until I teach you a lesson you'll never forget." Before Lily could react, Mrs. Grace's hand lashed out, striking her across the face. The force of the blow sent her stumbling backward, crashing into the dining table. Pain exploded through her cheek, and stars danced before her eyes. She cried out, more from shock than pain, her hands flying up to shield herself. But Mrs. Grace wasn't done. She advanced on Lily, her face twisted into a mask of fury. "You think you can just beg and whine and take what isn't yours?" she spat, grabbing Lily by the arm and dragging her upright. "You think you deserve anything?" "No." "Please," Lily gasped, struggling in Mrs. Grace's grip, terror clawing at her throat. "I'm sorry, I didn't." Mrs. Grace cut her off with another slap, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. Lily's vision blurred, and she crumpled to the floor, her head spinning. She tried to crawl away, to escape the storm of rage that had been unleashed upon her, but Mrs. Grace grabbed her by the hair, yanking her back. "You're a pest," Mrs. Gray snarled, her voice trembling with hatred. "A filthy little pest that needs to be taught a lesson." She raised her hand, and for a heartbeat, everything went still. Time seemed to freeze as Lily looked up at her. Fear and pain etched across her dirt-streaked face. Then the world exploded into chaos. Mrs. Grace brought her hand down, striking Lily again and again. Each blow sent shockwaves of pain through Lily's frail body, each strike driving her closer to the edge of darkness. She cried out, the sound a strangled wail of agony that was swallowed by the cold, empty room. Lily felt herself being thrown backward, her body crashing into the corner of the table. A sharp, searing pain shot through her skull as she struck the edge, and the world went black. She crumpled to the floor, her body limp and unresponsive, the darkness closing in around her. Mrs. Gray stood over her, her chest heaving, eyes wide and wild. For a moment, the only sound in the room was her ragged breathing. She stared down at Lily's still form, a mixture of satisfaction and horror flickering across her face. Slowly, she stepped back, her heart pounding as the reality of what she had done settled over her. "Lily," she called, her voice shaky, filled with a hint of fear. But there was no response. Lily lay motionless, her face pale, a trickle of blood seeping from a cut on her forehead. Mrs. Gray swallowed hard, panic rising in her chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had meant to scare the girl, to teach her a lesson. But now it had gone too far. She turned on her heel and hurried out of the room, her mind racing. She needed to think, to figure out what to do next. As the door slammed shut, silence descended over the room, heavy and suffocating. Lily lay in the center of it, her small body curled in on itself, her face obscured by a curtain of tangled hair. The air around her grew colder, the shadows in the room deepening, as if they were reaching out to her, wrapping around her like a shroud. And somewhere in the darkness of unconsciousness, a spark of rage flickered within Lily, a darkness that began to stir. Mrs. Grace had set a trap for a hungry, desperate child, but she had no idea what kind of storm she had just unleashed. The silence pressed in, thick and foreboding, holding its breath as it waited for what was to come. Part 5. A vengeful spirit awakens. Lily stirred, her mind clouded with a thick fog as she struggled to open her eyes. A strange sensation washed over her, neither warmth nor cold, but an eerie numbness that seemed to seep through her very being. Darkness surrounded her, an endless, suffocating void that pressed in on her from all sides. She tried to move, to cry out, but found herself paralyzed, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. Then, slowly, sensations began to trickle back. Pain. Yes, pain was the first to make itself known. Her head throbbed, a sharp, agonizing pulse that radiated through her skull. She remembered hitting the table. Yes, the memory came rushing back in pieces. Gracie's sneering face, the blows raining down on her, the shattering impact as her body had collided with the hard wood. And then, nothing. With a surge of effort, she managed to wrench her eyes open, gasping for breath, only to find herself staring into the darkness. It was cold and unfeeling, stretching out in every direction. Panic gripped her heart as she realized she couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet. It was as if she was suspended in a void, neither standing nor lying down. Fear gnawed at the edges of her mind. Where am I? What happened to me? As her eyes adjusted, she caught sight of a faint light in the distance. It was dim, flickering like a dying ember in a sea of shadows. She reached for it instinctively, stretching out her hand, or at least what she thought was her hand. It was difficult to be sure. Her body felt strange, insubstantial, as if it were merely a whisper in the air rather than solid flesh and bone. The light grew closer, expanding and brightening until it engulfed her. In that moment, the fog in her mind lifted, and she saw the room around her, the very room where Mrs. Grace had beaten her, leaving her to crumple on the floor like a discarded rag doll. Only now she wasn't on the floor. She was hovering above it, her form hazy and translucent. A terrifying realization clawed its way into her consciousness. She had died. This was no dream, no nightmare she could wake from. She was dead. A strangled sound escaped her lips, a gasp that resonated with a chilling echo. She looked down at her own body lying on the floor, pale and still, her eyes closed, a trickle of dry blood marking her temple. Her small frame seemed so fragile, so broken, lying there in the midst of the grand dining room that had become her tomb. Rage welled up inside her, burning hotter than the pain. Mrs. Grace had done this to her. Mrs. Grace and that treacherous servant Anne had lured her into this house with promises of food, only to unleash cruelty upon her. The injustice of it all filled her with a fury so intense that it threatened to consume her very essence. Why, she whispered, though the sound was more like a wisp of wind than an actual voice, why did they do this to me? There was no answer, only the oppressive silence of the room and the coldness of death. But within that silence, something dark stirred. A whisper in her mind, a voice that was both hers and not hers. It spoke of revenge, of retribution for the wrong she had suffered. It called to the fury within her, urging it to grow, to become something more than mere anger, something that could act, and she listened. She let the rage swell, filling the void inside her until it became a roaring storm. She wasn't powerless anymore. She might have been a helpless child in life, but now she was something different, something stronger. She was a spirit of vengeance, freed from the chains of her mortal body, driven by a single purpose to make them pay with newfound resolve. She willed herself forward. Moving was strange. There was no sensation of muscles contracting or bones shifting. It was more like thinking herself into motion, her will propelling her forward as she drifted through the air. She slipped out of the dining room, passing through the door as if it were made of mist, and entered the hallway. The house felt different now, colder and darker. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching long and foreboding. The air was thick, almost oppressive, carrying the weight of her anger and sorrow. She could sense it in every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wooden beams overhead. The house seemed to recognize her presence, to respond to her rage with a shiver of unease. Lily floated down the hallway, her gaze fixed ahead as she made her way to the front door. She passed through it effortlessly, emerging into the outside world. The marketplace lay beyond, bustling and alive, oblivious to the darkness that had awakened within its midst. She drifted toward it, moving like a wraith, unseen and unheard by those she passed. Yet, as she moved, a cold wind swept through the market, making people shiver and glance around, sensing an unnatural chill. She wandered through the market, unseen, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the vendors and shoppers. They went about their business, laughing, haggling, carrying on as if nothing had changed. As if she had never existed. A part of her longed to scream, to shout at them, to make them see her and acknowledge her suffering. But she held back. They were not her target, not yet. Her eyes fell upon Mrs. Grace's house, standing at the far end of the market street, tall and foreboding. Her anger flared anew, a surge of fury so strong it made the air around her grow icy. This was where it had happened. This was where she had died, betrayed and broken. And this was where she would begin her revenge. She slipped back into the house, her presence causing a faint ripple in the air, a whisper of cold that made the curtains stir and the lights flicker. It felt like slipping into a shell that had been discarded, a place now tainted by the darkness of her death. She moved through the hallway, her anger trailing behind her like a dark mist, seeping into the cracks of the walls and the crevices of the floor. Mrs. Grace was in the parlor, sipping tea with a look of satisfied calm on her face. She had cleaned up after the incident, as she had come to call it, and now sat as though nothing had happened, as though she hadn't beaten a child to death just the day before. Anne stood nearby, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes downcast. The room was filled with an air of tension, though neither spoke of what had transpired. Lily floated there, watching them with eyes that burned like coals in the darkness. The sight of Mrs. Grace, so smug and unrepentant, ignited a fire in her chest, a rage that demanded release. She focused on the lights above them, willing them to flicker to respond to her presence. And they did. The chandelier swayed, the bulbs dimming and brightening erratically, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Mrs. Grace looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What in the world?" she muttered, glancing at Anne. "Did you do something to the lights?" Anne shook her head, her face pale. "No, ma'am. I haven't touched anything." Lily's anger swelled, and the chandelier flickered violently, casting the room into brief, strobe-like darkness. A cold wind swept through the room, rattling the windows and sending a chill down the spines of the living occupants. Anne gasped, taking a step back, her eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Grace rose from her chair, her face tall with annoyance. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Anne, check the windows. Make sure none of them are open." But Anne didn't move. She was frozen in place, staring at something across the room. Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice quivering. Lily smiled, though it was not a smile of warmth. It was a smile of malice, of triumph. She let the sound come forth, the soft, sorrowful sound of a child sobbing. It filled the room, echoing off the walls and seeping into every corner. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, as the sound swirled around Mrs. Grace and Anne like a chilling embrace. Mrs. Grace paled, her eyes darting around the room. Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her attempt at authority. Lily did answer. Instead, she moved toward the kitchen, where the appliances sat in silent vigil. She reached out with her wheel, and one by one, they sprang to life. The stove ignited with a sudden whoosh, the oven light flickered on, and the kettle began to whistle a high, shrill note that echoed through the house. In the parlor, Mrs. Grace and Anne jumped at the noise, their faces contorting in fear. "What is happening?" Mrs. Grace cried, grabbing Anne's arm in a tight grip. "Oh, check the kitchen." Anne stumbled forward, her steps shaky and hesitant. She pushed open the kitchen door, only to be greeted by the sight of every appliance running on its own. The stove's flames danced wildly, the kettle screeched, and the lights above buzzed ominously. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned back, her face ashen. "There's no one here," she choked out. "It's happening on its own." Lily hovered behind her, unseen but very much felt. The air around Anne grew frigid, her breath misting in the unnatural cold. Lily reached out, her ethereal hand passing through Anne's shoulder, and the woman gasped, stumbling back as if struck. She clutched at her chest, her eyes wide with terror as she looked around wildly, searching for the source of the icy touch. In the parlor, Mrs. Grace was backing away, her face twisted in horror. "This is madness," she screamed. "Get out of my house. Whoever you are, get out." Lily's laughter filled the air, a haunting, bitter sound that chilled the blood of anyone who heard it. "I'm already here," it seemed to say. "I've always been here, and I'm not leaving until I've had my revenge." She let the lights flicker again, casting the room into alternating bursts of light and shadow. The sobbing grew louder, mingling with the wailing of the kettle and the crackling of the stove flames. It was chaos, a cacophony of sounds that reverberated through the house like a symphony of despair. Mrs. Grace stumbled back against the wall, her eyes wild, her chest heaving. She could feel it now, the presence, the cold, the weight of something otherworldly pressing down on her. "What do you want?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with panic. Lily floated closer, her eyes glowing with a vengeful fire. She wanted many things. She wanted them to feel the fear she had felt, the pain, the helplessness. She wanted them to know that they could not escape the consequences of their cruelty. She wanted them to suffer just as she had. And so she began to torment them, her presence becoming a malevolent force within the house. Lights flickered, objects moved of their own accord, and the chilling sound of her sobbing filled every room. She was relentless, her rage fueling her power, driving the terror that gripped Mrs. Grace and Anne with every passing hour. They would learn, they would know what it meant to wrong the helpless, to turn their backs on the suffering of others. They would feel the wrath of the spirit they had created, the vengeful ghost of the girl they had beaten and discarded. For Lily was no longer just a beggar. She was a spirit of fury, a haunting that would not be silenced until justice was served. and as the house creaked and groaned under the weight of her wrath, it became clear that this was just the beginning of their torment. Part 6. The haunting begins. The days that followed were a nightmare for Mrs. Grace. The once grand and orderly house now thrummed with a sinister energy, turning it into a labyrinth of shadows and fear. Gone was the comfort and security she had once taken for granted. In its place was a chilling, almost palpable sense of being watched, a never-present gaze that seemed to pierce through the walls and ceilings, following her every move. The supernatural events grew more unsettling by the day. At first it had been minor flickering lights, the inexplicable chill in the air. Then it had escalated appliances turning on by themselves, eerie sobbing echoing through the empty hallways, and objects moving when no one was looking. Mrs. Grace had tried to maintain her composure, brushing off the incidents as mere coincidences, perhaps the effects of a drafty old house. But deep down she felt the growing presence of something wrong, something unnatural that made her skin crawl and her heart pound. And the servant had grown increasingly pale and withdrawn, jumping at every creak and gust of wind. Mrs. Grace found herself snapping at her more often, her temper flaring in the face of her own mounting fear. She refused to acknowledge the truth, refused to let herself believe that the beggar girl, Lily, had returned to torment her. Yet every night she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of unseen eyes boring into her soul. One evening, the tension reached a breaking point. The house was eerily silent, as if it were holding its breath. Outside the wind howled, rattling the windows, a mournful wail that made Mrs. Grace's heart race. She sat in her room, trying to distract herself with a book, but the words swam before her eyes, meaningless and jumbled. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the room was far colder than it should have been. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, shivering as she glanced at the fireplace. The flames crackled and danced, but their warmth seemed unable to penetrate the chill that had settled in the room. As the minutes ticked by, a sense of dread crept over her, prickling the back of her neck. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something terrible. She listened intently, straining to hear any noise, but the house was silent. Too silent, her fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, her knuckles turning white as she scanned the room, her eyes flicking to the door. And then it began. A soft, rhythmic knocking broke the silence, echoing through the room. Knock, knock, knock. It was slow and deliberate, like the beating of a heart. Mrs. Grace froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came from her bedroom door, just a few feet away. For a moment, she sat paralyzed, staring at the door, her mind whirling with fear. Who could it be? Anne was downstairs, and Timmy. Timmy should have been asleep. The knocking continued, insistent and unrelenting. Knock, knock, knock. Each sound sent a jolt of terror through her, making her skin crawl. Swallowing hard, she forced herself to stand, her legs trembling beneath her as she took a hesitant step toward the door. Her hand shook as she reached out, fingers curling around the cold metal of the doorknob. With a quick twist, she flung the door open, her heart pounding in her chest as her eyes fell upon the figure standing in the hallway. It was Timmy, her son. He stood there, his face eerily blank, eyes staring straight ahead as if he were in a trance. The sight of him made her blood run cold. He looked wrong. There was no light in his eyes, no sign of the cheerful boy she knew. Instead, his face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line, his posture unnaturally stiff. Timmy, she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. What are you doing up? He didn't respond. Didn't even blink. He just stood there, staring at her with that blank, hollow expression. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized that his gaze wasn't focused on her. It was looking past her, through her, at something in the darkness beyond. And then she saw it. A shadow moved in the dim light of the hallway, a figure slowly emerging from the darkness behind Timmy. Mrs. Grace's breath hitched, her eyes widening in horror as she recognized the shape of a young girl. Lily. She was standing there, half hidden in shadow, her eyes glowing with an unnatural, burning fury that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. Her hair hung around her face in tangled strands, framing eyes that blazed with a terrible rage. The air around them grew colder, an icy wind swirling through the hallway, causing the candles to flicker violently. Mrs. Gray stumbled back, her heart racing, as she tried to comprehend the sight before her. This can't be real. It's impossible, but the room around her told a different story. The chill, the shadows, the feeling of crushing dread, it was all too real. Timmy took a step forward, his movements slow and mechanical, like a puppet being manipulated by unseen strings. Mrs. Grace's mouth went dry as she backed away, her gaze darting between her son and the vengeful spirit looming behind him. "There, Lily," she stammered, her voice barely more than a croak. You're dead." The shadowy figure tilted its head, and a cruel smile spread across Lily's face, one that was devoid of warmth or humanity. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, the temperature in the room plummeted, and Mrs. Grace felt a wave of nausea roll through her as the air grew thick with an unnatural cold. "Timmy," Mrs. Grace gasped, reaching out to her son, her mind a whirlwind of panic and confusion. "Snap out of it. Come to me," but Timmy didn't move. He stood there, staring straight ahead, his eyes glassy and empty. Behind him, Lily stepped forward, her movements smooth and ghostly, like mist drifting through the air. Mrs. Grace's heart pounded wildly, terror seizing her as she watched Lily approach, her form flickering like a shadow in a storm. The room dimmed, the lights fading until only the faint, eerie glow of the hallway remained. Mrs. Grace could see her breath misting in the air, a stark contrast to the summer warmth that should have filled the house. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee from this nightmare, but her feet felt glued to the floor, rooted by the sheer horror of what she was witnessing. Lily stopped in front of Timmy, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Grace's face. They were like twin embers, burning with an intensity that made Mrs. Grace feel as though they were scorching her soul. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, a low, haunting sob filled the air, echoing off the walls, a sound of sorrow and rage that sent shivers down Mrs. Grace's spine. No, Mrs. Grace screamed, clapping her hands over her ears in a desperate attempt to block out the sound. But it was no use. The sobbing grew louder, filling the room, reverberating inside her skull until it was all she could hear. And then the pressure started. An invisible force gripped her throat, cold and unyielding, squeezing tighter and tighter. Mrs. Grace gasped, her eyes bulging as she clawed at her neck, trying to pry away the phantom hands that were choking the life out of her. She stumbled back, her body convulsing with terror as the pressure increased, cutting off her air supply. "Lily," she choked out, her voice strangled, barely a whisper. "Stop." Please. The figure of Lily remained motionless, her eyes boring into Mrs. Grace with a hatred that was almost tangible. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in around them like a shroud. As the temperature continued to drop, Mrs. Grace could feel her heartbeat slowing, her vision dimming at the edges as she fought for every breath. This is it, she thought frantically, panic rising within her. This is how it ends. She had to do something, anything to break free from this invisible grip. But her hands flailed uselessly, finding nothing to grasp onto, nothing to fight against. Just when she thought she would lose consciousness, the pressure eased, and the cold grip around her throat loosened. Mrs. Grace collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. She looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks, to see Lily still standing there, her expression unchanged. Timmy remained in front of the spirit, unmoving, his face blank and pale. Mrs. Grace clutched at her chest, struggling to breathe, her mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. "Why?" she croaked, her voice ragged. "Why are you doing this?" Lily tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as the sobbing faded into a chilling silence. The shadows around her seemed to pulse, growing darker and thicker, as if feeding off the fear that permeated the room. Slowly, she extended a hand toward Mrs. Grace, her fingers outstretched, reaching. reaching. Mrs. Grace screamed, her voice shattering the silence as she scrambled backward, pushing herself against the far wall. "No, stay away from me," she cried, her voice high-pitched, almost hysterical. But the spirit did not move. She remained there, her hand hovering in the air, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Grace with a gaze that was both haunting and unforgiving. It was as if she was staring into the very depths of Mrs. Grace's soul, laying bare every sin, every act of cruelty, every ounce of malice. And then with a final, bone-chilling glance, Lily turned away. The shadows around her swirled, and she vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the faintest echo of her sobbing, a sound that lingered in the air long after she was gone. Timmy blinked, his eyes clearing as he looked around in confusion. "Mom," he mumbled, his voice small and frightened. "What happened?" Mrs. Grace could only stare at him, her chest heaving with the effort to breathe, her mind spinning with horror. She had seen it, felt it. The ghost of Lily had returned, not just as a shadow, but as a force of vengeance, a haunting that would not rest until justice had been served. And in the silence that followed, Mrs. Grace knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. Part 7. Timmy's Plea. The cold, darkened room felt like a tomb as Mrs. Grace crumpled to the floor, her chest heaving with desperate, gasping breaths. The ghostly grip around her throat had momentarily loosened, but its chilling touch still lingered, as if reminding her that it could return at any moment. The air was thick with tension, a suffocating dread that pressed down on everything within the room. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching into twisted, grotesque forms under the faint flicker of the candles. Timmy stood near the doorway, his eyes wide and frantic. His earlier trance had broken, leaving him in a bewildered and terrified state. He watched his mother on the ground, her face pale and contorted with fear, struggling for breath. His heart pounded violently against his ribs as he tried to comprehend what was happening. "Mom," he cried out, stumbling forward. "Mom, what's going on?" His voice trembled, laced with a child's fear, the fear of seeing a parent, usually so strong and unyielding, brought to their knees by some unseen force. But Mrs. Grace could not answer. She was still clawing at her throat, her breaths coming in ragged gasps, as if the very air around her had turned into a deadly poison. Her eyes darted around the room wild and desperate, searching for the source of her torment. And then she saw it her Lily stood in the shadows, her form flickering like a phantom caught between two worlds. Her eyes burned with a fury that seemed to set the very air ablaze, glowing with an unearthly light that pierced through the darkness. Her gaze was locked onto Mrs. Grace, a cold and unforgiving stare that spoke of vengeance and pain. The temperature in the room plummeted further, each breath turning to mist in the frigid air. "Mrs." Grace's mouth opened in a soundless scream, her hands flailing, as if trying to push away the invisible hands squeezing her throat. Her terror was palpable, a raw, frantic energy that filled the room and made the shadows quiver with anticipation. She tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but no sound emerged, only a strangled croak that dissolved into the silence. And then, cutting through the chaos, came Timmy's voice. "Lily, stop," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He stumbled forward, his small hands outstretched as he faced the ghostly figure that had once been a girl. "Please don't hurt her." For a heartbeat, the room went silent. The shadows seemed to hold their breath, and the icy grip around Mrs. Grace's throat paused, leaving her gasping for air. Lily's eyes flickered, the flames within them wavering as if disturbed by an unexpected gust of wind. Slowly she turned her gaze toward Timmy. In that moment, her furious glare softened, the blazing embers of her eyes dimming to a smoldering glow. She stared at the boy standing before her, the only person who had ever shown her even a glimmer of kindness in life. The memory of his small, outstretched hand offering her a bundle of rice flashed through her mind, the way he had risked his mother's wrath to give her food, to show her compassion when no one else would. "Lily," Timmy continued, his voice trembling but determined, "please, I know you're angry, I know she hurt you. But this isn't you." Tears welled in his eyes, his lips quivering as he took another step forward. "You don't have to do this. Please, Let her go. Lily's form wavered, her outline blurring, as if she were a candle flame swaying in the wind. The rage inside her, which had burned so fiercely moments before, began to waver under the weight of his words. She could feel his fear, his desperation, but most of all, his compassion. Even now, in the face of her wrath, he was pleading for the life of the very person who had brought her so much pain. The room was deathly quiet, save for the sound of Mrs. Grace's ragged breathing as she clutched her chest, her eyes wide with terror. The darkness that had cloaked the room seemed to recede slightly, the temperature inching upward, as if the shadows themselves were hesitating. Lily drifted closer to Timmy, her movements slow and uncertain. She gazed down at him, at the tears shining in his eyes, and felt the turmoil within herself. The fury that had fueled her, that had given her strength, now warred with something softer, something that spoke of mercy and regret. It was as though the memory of the girl she had once been was battling against the vengeful spirit she had become. Timmy reached out to her, his hand trembling but steady in its resolve. "You were kind to me," he whispered, his voice tight with emotion. "You didn't deserve what happened, but hurting her, it won't change what she did. It won't bring you peace." Lily's breath hitched, or at least what would have been a breath if she still had lungs to breathe. His words cut through the fog of her rage, piercing into the depths of her restless spirit. He was right. She had been wronged, had suffered more than anyone should, but what was she becoming in her quest for vengeance? Would this anger ever truly soothe the pain in her heart? For a long moment she stood there, staring at Timmy, the echoes of her sobs filling the room in a mournful, haunting melody. The shadows around her quivered, wavering as though caught in an invisible struggle. She turned her gaze back to Mrs. Grace, who was now slumped against the wall, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and remorse. A flicker of doubt crossed Lily's face. In life she had wanted nothing more than to be seen, to be treated with kindness and dignity. And now, here was Timmy offering her that kindness again, even in the midst of her wrath. Could she turn away from that light? Could she choose to relent, to step back from the edge of the darkness that threatened to consume her? Slowly she withdrew, her form becoming fainter, less defined. The room grew warmer, the oppressive cold easing as she took a step back. The grip around Mrs. Grace's throat released entirely, leaving her gasping for breath, her body shivering with relief and terror. She looked up at Lily, her eyes pleading, not with defiance but with a fragile hope for mercy. Lily regarded Mrs. Grace for a long silent moment. The anger still simmered within her, but it was no longer the all-consuming inferno it had been. Timmy's words had reached her, had stirred the remnants of the girl she had once been, the girl who had longed for kindness, for understanding. With a final glance at Timmy, she allowed herself to fade into the shadows, her form dissolving into the darkness that clung to the corners of the room. The air grew still, the last echoes of her presence fading away, leaving behind a silence that was thick with both sorrow and relief. Timmy collapsed to his knees, his body racked with sobs. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking with emotion. "Thank you." Lily, Mrs. Grace, lay on the floor, her hands clutching her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks as she gasped for breath. The terror that had gripped her was unlike anything she had ever known, and it left her hollow, shaken to her very core. She stared at the spot where Lily had stood, her mind a swirl of horror, regret, and a newfound understanding of the consequences of her cruelty. As the silence settled over the room, Timmy crawled over to his mother, his eyes red and puffy from crying. "Mom," he said softly, his voice trembling, "you need to make this right. You need to do something for her." Mrs. Grace looked at him, her vision blurred by tears. She nodded, though words failed her. She didn't know how, but in that moment she realized that what had happened here was not just an encounter with a spirit, but a confrontation with her own cruelty. And that perhaps was a true haunting, for now the room was quiet. The shadows retreated to their corners, and the air was no longer ice cold. But somewhere, lingering just beyond the veil of this world, Lily watched. She would wait, her gaze forever fixed on those who had wronged her. She had shown mercy, but the pain remained, and the future held its own questions. The ghost was not vanquished, she had simply stepped back into the darkness to watch, to judge, and to see if change was possible. And in that haunting quiet, Mrs. Grace and Timmy knew that the peace was fragile, a temporary reprieve granted by the play of a child and the reluctant mercy of a spirit. Part 8. Regret and Redemption. Mrs. Grace remained on the floor, her body trembling violently, as if it would never regain its strength. Her chest heaved with each ragged breath, a mix of relief and lingering terror. The room had grown warmer, but an icy chill persisted deep inside her, clinging to her bones as a reminder of the terror she had just faced. Timmy was by her side, clutching her hand, his small fingers gripping hers with a desperation that mirrored the turmoil churning inside her. For what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Grace couldn't move. The cold fingers that had gripped her throat, the darkness that had loomed behind Timmy, all of it replayed in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. And then there was Lily, the vengeful spirit, eyes blazing with fury and sorrow, hovering like an avenging angel ready to strike down its judgment. The memory of that encounter left Mrs. Grace shivering. It wasn't just fear that consumed her, it was the overwhelming flood of regret. She had seen it in Lily's eyes, an agony so profound that it had transformed into wrath. Mrs. Grace squeezed her eyes shut, but the vision persisted, haunting the darkness behind her eyelids. She had been the cause of that suffering. She had turned an innocent, desperate child into a specter of vengeance. Tears welled in Mrs. Grace's eyes and spilled down her cheeks, each drop stinging like a confession of her guilt. She had struck Lily down, dismissed her humanity, and now she had faced the consequences. "What have I done?" she choked out, her voice barely a whisper, trembling with grief and horror. "Oh God, what have I done?" Timmy remained silent, his small hand never leaving hers. He watched his mother, his young face pale and troubled. He didn't fully understand what had transpired, but he could sense the gravity of it, the weight of something terrible that had just passed over them. As the minutes ticked by, Mrs. Grace finally managed to push herself up into a sitting position, her body swaying as if she were a marionette cut free from its strings. She wrapped her arms around herself, clutching at her own shoulders as if to hold herself together. A sob broke free from her lips, a sound so raw and filled with sorrow that it hung in the air like a lament. "I did this," she murmured, staring at the floor with hollow eyes. "I caused this pain." She looked up at Timmy, her gaze haunted and broken. She was just a child, and I turned her into that. Timmy didn't say anything. What could he say? He was a child too, struggling to grasp the enormity of the situation. Yet, he squeezed his mother's hand gently, his touch a small, silent offering of comfort in the midst of the storm that raged inside her. Mrs. Grace took a shuddering breath, her mind swirling with memories of that fateful day at the market. She had seen Lily as nothing more than a nuisance, a beggar to be brushed aside. In her mind, she had justified her cruelty, telling herself that it was the way of the world, that beggars had no place in her life of order and prosperity. And yet, here she was, reduced to this trembling, sobbing wreck by the spirit of the very girl she had cast aside. I was wrong, she thought, the realization settling over her like a cold, heavy weight. So horribly, unforgivably wrong. With an effort, Mrs. Grace pulled herself to her feet, leaning heavily against the wall as the room spun around her. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to stand, to face the aftermath of what she had done. The air around her was still, the oppressive cold easing, but a deeper chill settled into her heart, a chill born not of ghost but of guilt. From that day forward, Mrs. Grace was a changed woman. It didn't happen overnight. The darkness she carried within her was not so easily banished. But the encounter with Lily's vengeful spirit had shattered something inside her, cracked the hardened shell of indifference she had built around her soul. She began with small acts of penance. The next morning, she went to the marketplace, her face drawn and pale, her eyes haunted by sleepless nights filled with echoes of Lily's sobs. She approached the vendors and the poor with a humility that was foreign to her previous demeanor. When she saw children begging, she no longer turned away. Instead, she reached into her purse, offering food, money, anything she could to ease their suffering. It was a quiet atonement, her own form of redemption for the cruelty she had once shown. The marketplace took notice of her transformation. The merchants and beggars, who had once known her as a stern, unapproachable woman, now saw her as someone different. There was a sadness in her eyes that wasn't there before, a gentleness in her gestures as she handed out bread and coins. They didn't know the full story of what had happened, but they could see the change in her, the remorse that guided her every action. But despite her efforts, Mrs. Grace found no peace. Every night she returned to her house, feeling the shadows that lingered in the corners, the cold spots that crept into the rooms like a silent reproach. She could feel Lily's presence, even if she couldn't see her. It was as if the spirit had become a part of the house, woven into the very fabric of its walls. When she walked through the hallway, she sometimes caught a glimpse of a shadow flickering out of the corner of her eye, a fleeting shape that vanished as soon as she turned to look. In the stillness of the night, she often heard the faint sound of sobbing echoing through the darkened corridors. It was a haunting reminder that though she had begun to change, her past deeds could never be undone. One evening, Mrs. Grace found herself standing in front of the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames. Timmy was already asleep, his small body curled up under the blankets in his room. The house was quiet, but not at peace. She could feel it, the lingering weight of Lily's presence, the unfinished business that hovered over them like a storm cloud. A tear slipped down Mrs. Grace's cheek as she looked into the fire. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know it doesn't change what I did. I know I can never undo the pain I caused you. But I'm trying. I'm trying to be better." Her words hung in the air, swallowed by the silence that filled the room. There was no response, no sign of the spirit that haunted her, only the crackling of the fire and the shadows that danced on the walls. Still, she continued. Day after day, she returned to the marketplace, offering help to those in need. She donated to charities, visited orphanages, and provided food for the poor. Each act was a small step toward redemption, a way of chipping away at the mountain of guilt that loomed over her. The people in the market began to greet her with cautious smiles, their suspicion slowly giving way to gratitude. They saw the sincerity in her actions, the earnestness in her attempts to make amends. But no matter how much she gave, no matter how many people she helped, the memory of what she had done to Lily never left her. The girl's face haunted her dreams, her eyes burning with a mixture of pain and accusation. And in the shadows of her house, Mrs. Grace sometimes felt a presence watching her, a cold gaze that seemed to pierce through to the very core of her soul. There were nights when she would wake up, her heart pounding, the sound of soft footsteps echoing in the hallway outside her bedroom. She would sit up, clutching the blankets to her chest, listening intently as the footsteps grew nearer, then faded into silence. It was as if Lily was still there, walking the halls, a restless spirit that had not yet found peace. Mrs. Grace knew that this haunting would never truly end. She could spend the rest of her life trying to atone for her cruelty, but the memory of her actions would remain, etched into the walls of her house and the corners of her mind. It was her burden to bear, her punishment for the callousness she had shown to a child in need. And yet, in that burden, she found the strength to continue. For every time she felt the chill of Lily's presence, it reminded her of the consequences of her past, urging her to keep going, to help others, to be the person she should have been from the start. It was a haunting that drove her toward goodness, a shadow that guided her path toward redemption. As the years passed, Mrs. Grace became known in the marketplace not as the stern, uncaring woman she had once been, but as a benefactor to those in need. She built shelters for the homeless, provided meals for hungry children, and worked tirelessly to make up for her past cruelty. And though the guilt never faded, and the haunting presence of Lily never completely left her, she found solace in the fact that she was trying to be better. In the end, Mrs. Grace's life became a testament to the power of remorse and the difficult path toward redemption. She could never erase what she had done, could never bring back the life she had snuffed out. But she could honor Lee's memory by dedicating her life to kindness, to helping those she had once scorned. And perhaps, in the quiet moments when the shadows closed in and the air grew cold, Lily watched from the darkness, her fury softened into a quiet, watchful presence, witnessing the change she had inspired. And so, the haunting continued not as a curse, but as a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable wrongs, the path to redemption was paved with actions, not words, Mrs. Grace walked that path every day, guided by the shadow of the girl she had wronged, and the silent hope that one day her efforts might bring peace to them both. Part 9. The Whisper of Hunger. The marketplace slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but a shadow had been cast over its lively chaos, a shadow that lingered like the chill of an unending winter. Vendors resumed their calls, selling their goods and wares, the scent of fresh produce mingling with their aroma of grilled meats and baked bread. Children dashed about, playing games amidst the bustling crowd, and the hum of life filled every corner of the market. Yet, beneath the surface, there was an unspoken understanding, a sense that something had changed. The tragedy that had unfolded in their midst had left an indelible mark on the hearts of the market's regulars. It was as though the spirit of that fateful event had seeped into the cobblestones, embedding itself into the soul of the marketplace. The air held a different weight now, a quiet, unsettling heaviness that everyone felt but no one spoke of. On the surface, life continued. But those who moved through the market each day, who knew its nooks and crannies and the familiar faces of the beggars who lined its edges, sensed that something was different. They noticed it in the way Mrs. Grace walked with a bowed head, her once stern eyes now softened by sorrow and regret as she offered food and money to those in need. They saw it in the way vendors gave a little more freely, slipping an extra piece of fruit or a loaf of bread into the hands of the children who passed by with hungry eyes. It was as if the market had collectively been humbled by the haunting presence of what had happened, as though the ghost of the past now whispered reminders into the ears of those who crossed its path. But it wasn't just the memory of the event that lingered. There was something else, something that clung to the market like a shadow that refused to dissipate. It came with the cold mornings when the mist hung low over the stalls, curling around the legs of the vendors like the tendrils of an unseen spectre. In those moments when the sun had not yet chased away the chill and the world was cloaked in a muted, grey light, those who listened carefully claimed they could hear it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze, so soft it was almost imperceptible. "I'm so hungry." The first time it was heard, it was dismissed as nothing more than the murmur of the wind, a figment of imagination in the cold dawn. But as the weeks passed, more people began to hear it. Sometimes it was a lone vendor setting up his stall before sunrise, his hands stiff with cold as he arranged vegetables and fruit on the wooden display. He would pause, shivering, and look up, his eyes scanning the foggy expanse of the market, searching for the source of the whisper. But there was nothing, no one there, only the rustling of leaves and the creak of wooden beams. Other times it was a beggar huddled in a corner, wrapped in threadbare rags, his stomach growling with the edge of hunger. He would hear the faintest sigh, a voice so frail and mournful that it made his skin prickle. The words, though barely more than a breath, struck with a weight that made his heart skip a beat. "I'm so hungry," the whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, slipping through the cracks in the walls and drifting across the cobblestones like a wandering spirit. Word spread quietly among the marketplace folk. The whispers were spoken of in hushed tones, often over a steaming cup of tea or during the lulls between waves of customers. "Did you hear it?" they would ask one another, eyes darting nervously to the shadows. That voice. That girl's voice. "She's still here. Isn't she?" The older vendors would shake their heads, their faces etched with lines of worry and sorrow. "It's the spirit of the beggar girl," they would murmur. "She's still hungry, still wandering these streets." Mrs. Grace heard the stories, of course. She couldn't avoid them, no matter how hard she tried. Each time she ventured into the market, they seemed to find her. Those whispers of the whisper, those ghostly words that sent chills racing down her spine. Every time she caught a glimpse of the beggars, the children with gaunt faces and empty eyes, she felt the memory of Lily crashing over her like a tidal wave. She had changed, yes. She had dedicated her life to helping the poor, giving away food and money in an attempt to ease the suffering she had once ignored. But despite her efforts, the weight of her past never left her. It hung over her like a shroud, a constant reminder of the girl she had wronged. And now, it seemed that Lily's spirit had woven itself into the very fabric of the market, a haunting presence that would never let her or anyone else forget. On one particularly cold morning, Mrs. Grace stood by a stall, handing out warm bread to the children who had gathered. The fog was thick, and the air was sharp with the bite of winter. She shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. And as she passed the last piece of bread to a small boy with wide, hollow eyes, she heard it. "I'm so hungry." The voice was so faint, so ghostly, that it felt like it came from the air itself. Mrs. Grace froze, the bread slipping from her grasp as she whipped her head around, her eyes scanning the fog for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, only the swirling mist and the faint outlines of the stalls around her. The children stared at her, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. But they only shook their heads, their small faces puzzled. Mrs. Grace swallowed hard, her heart thudding in her chest. She knew that voice, she would know it anywhere. It was Lily. Mrs. Grace felt the blood drain from her face, a wave of nausea washing over her. She reached out to steady herself against the stall, her mind reeling. Lily's spirit was still here, still bound to the marketplace by the hunger and suffering she had endured in life, and no amount of good deeds or charity could erase that. The past could not be undone, the pain could not be erased. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the whispers became a part of the market's daily life. They drifted on the wind, a soft reminder that echoed through the stalls and alleys. Whenever a vendor felt a sudden chill, whenever a beggar awoke to the sound of quiet sobbing in the pre-dawn darkness, they knew it was her. Lily, the beggar girl, wandering through the market as a restless spirit. Some said it was a warning, a reminder to treat the less fortunate with kindness, lest they too awaken something dreadful. Others believed it was Lily's way of seeking justice, her presence a constant demand for the compassion she had been denied in life. And for Mrs. Grace it was both a curse and a gift. A curse for the guilt it rekindled every day, and a gift for the change it inspired in her heart. "I'm so hungry." The whisper lingered in the air, not just as a sound but as a sensation that tugged at the heart. It was a cry for help that had gone unanswered in life, now echoing through the market as an eternal reminder of the cost of cruelty. The vendors and beggars alike would stop in their tracks, feeling the faint chill of the whisper pass through them. They would glance around, their eyes searching the mist for the shadow of a small, ragged figure that they all knew was there, even if they could not see her. And so, the marketplace continued its dance of life. But it was a dance shadowed by the spectre of the past. Mrs. Grace remained a fixture, her face etched with sorrow and regret, her hands always giving, always offering. She knew that she could never undo what had been done, that Lily's whisper would follow her for the rest of her days. It was a part of her now, a haunting reminder that some wrongs left scars that could never truly fade away. On the coldest mornings, when the fog was thick and the market was just awakening, the whisper would come again, drifting through the air like a lost soul seeking solace. It curled around the ears of the merchants and the beggars, a ghostly sigh that sent shivers down their spines. "I'm so hungry." The market would grow still for a moment, the bustling activity pausing as if to honor the presence that watched over them. And in that brief silence they remembered. They remembered the girl who had suffered the cruelty that had been shown, and the spirit that had risen from that suffering to demand compassion from the living iron time. The whisper became a legend of the market, passed down from vendor to vendor, beggar to beggar. The older ones would tell the children, "Listen closely and you'll hear her, the beggar girl who still walks among us." And every so often, in the quiet of dawn, someone would shiver and turn, swearing they had felt a touch of cold air brush past them, as if a small unseen hand had reached out in longing. And so life in the marketplace went on, forever changed. The tragedy of Lily, the beggar girl, had woven itself into the fabric of their world. Her whisper was a reminder, a haunting echo of the hunger that had gone unanswered and the spirits that such wrongs could awaken. For those who listened, it was a call to kindness, to remember the pain of the past, and to ensure that no one else would ever be left to whisper in hunger again.